What's up, everyone? My name is Wayne Unger, back for the next episode of our Election 2020 series. Today's conversation is going to be about race and systemic racism. Now, today's goal is really just to hit on the idiotic argument that the conservatives make that somehow America is not racist. Now, the facts just say that that's not true. So I want to combat that lie. And now, I want to also note that no video that I could ever create would be sufficient in covering this topic, but I'm going to give it my best shot to cover as much as I can. And for that, I'm going to speak quickly. Pardon that. So, let's look at the history of racism within this country, dating back to slavery, to the 1919 race riots, to Emmett Till and lynchings. Now, the concept of race, for example, now according to National Geographic, there is no scientific basis for race. Humans actually evolved. Every human, every Homo sapien started in Africa. And over the hundreds of thousands of years, we migrated out of Africa into other continents. And through that migration, we also evolved, right? So civilizations that stayed near the equator, where there's lots of sunlight, darker skin actually was a useful shield against UV radiation. But if you go towards the poles, the North and South Pole, where the problem is actually too little sun, paler skin actually promotes the production of vitamin D. Now, within the United States, between 1525 and 1866, 12.5 million people were kidnapped from Africa and sent to the Americas for the slave trade. We know that our founding fathers were slaveholders, from Thomas Jefferson to George Washington. We also know that they sexually abused slaves, such as Aaron Burr and James Madison. But our Constitution itself is inherently racist, right? We have the 3/5 compromise, which said all slaves were going to be 3/5 a person and not a whole person for the purposes of counting people within the United States. For example, with the census. Now, the Confederacy, fast forward to the Civil War. The Confederacy is not a nation on its own right, but it's in fact an illegitimate rebellion over slaves. Now, Abraham Lincoln, who tried to keep the Union together, also signed the Emancipation Proclamation, but he did some other things to ensure civil rights to recently freed slaves after the Civil War. So he created what's called the Freedmen's Bureau, which was part of the United States Army, and its goal was to aid former slaves through various support in housing, food, education, and property ownership. In fact, legislation during the Lincoln administration would have provided land and schools for children and even military courts to enforce these rights. This act, the Freedmen's Bureau Act, gave ex-slaves, quote, any of the civil rights or immunities belonging to white persons, including the right to inherit, purchase, lease, sell, hold, and convey real and personal property, basically full and equal civil rights, including the right to bear arms. That's what Lincoln wanted. Now, all of these efforts, after Lincoln was assassinated, were killed. They were shot down by President Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson, in fact, took the land back from blacks and African Americans and restored the land to pre-Civil War white owners. Now, property ownership is especially important, which I'll get to here in a second. But we inaccurately or misleadingly talk about the Civil War. So, for example, prior to 2018, Texas schools even taught that the Civil War was about states' rights and sectionalism, not slavery. That's just misleading. So, we are inherently perpetuating this narrative. Over time, we built systemic racism into our system. So racially explicit or implicit federal, state, and local policy perpetuated this. So for example, after the the World War II, where veterans were coming back to this country after fighting abroad, we had a major housing shortage, and this led to the Housing Act of 1949. Again, World War II. When civilian housing industry picked up in the 1950s and home builders were rapidly expanding homes, trying to keep up with the demand, the federal government actually said, hey, we will help. We will subsidize this, and we will create suburbs on the conditions that only suburban homes would be sold to white Americans. This led to whites who lived in otherwise white project housing that existed to migrate out of urban areas, and blacks and African Americans who were excluded from the opportunities to move to suburbs to kind of basically be forced to live in black project housing. And over the years, even the FHA, the Federal Housing Administration, supported these suburbs and maintained conditions on these suburbs that they were only going to be sold and resold to whites and not African Americans. This is how they subsidize suburbs. Now, this led to various zoning policies as well. So locally, zoning ordinances prohibited African Americans from moving onto majority white blocks. This all led to the concept of redlining, right? Chicago has this north-south divide where south is African American, north is majority white. Detroit has 8 Mile Road, and Washington, D.C. has like a river that separates these neighborhoods. And over time, these houses and property appreciated in value. So if we do not give property, as we did during the Civil War, to blacks and African Americans, then we take away an ability for them to have an economic prosperity, right? And let's fast forward to the 2008 recession, because this is how it also happened. In 2008, we know was caused by subprime mortgages, right? Banks and mortgage lenders specifically exploited minority communities with subprime loans. How did this happen? Well, they induced minority homeowners in refinancing their homes at low interest rates that eventually exploded into very high interest rates. And of course, they couldn't keep up. Nobody could. And these banks and mortgage lenders originated these loans to minority communities who otherwise would have qualified from an economic perspective for conventional loans. However, they were denied those loans and forced into the subprime loan market. Now, we know with the 2008 recession, subprime loans effed up, right? And we know that the result is massive amounts of foreclosures. Now, when you have a disproportionate number of Blacks and African Americans and other minorities in the subprime loan market facing foreclosure, then you also have a disproportionate number of minorities facing disclosure compared to their white counterparts. Whew. Okay, so over time, if we build wealth in this country through property ownership, right, and appreciation, then we have not allowed Blacks and African Americans, or we have taken away Blacks and African Americans their right to build economic prosperity. So what happens here? Well, we force people into poorer neighborhoods that are more prone to crime because they're poorer neighborhoods, and that leads to poorer educational outcomes, so a lack of an ability to move out of those classes. Now, this leads, of course, to societal and individual stereotyping. We stereotype those who live in poorer neighborhoods that are more prone to crime to have poor educational outcomes. And this, of course, builds an implicit bias in us. So all of these reasons, right, is how we are systemically racist as a country. Now, what can we do about it? Well, in November 3rd, in this election season, we can vote for people who recognize the systemic racism within this country and who have plans to combat it. So that's what we can do. As you're voting now in early voting, or as you're voting on November 3rd, if you go to the polls, vote. Vote for one, and then two, vote for people who recognize some of the inherent problems that we have built in this country, who can fix it, because our goal is to strive for a more perfect union. That is all, everyone. Take care. Talk to you next time.